Well, you're watching the Ukraine-Russian war. That gives you an idea of what it was like in World War II here and all over. And as I said earlier, the 3 years of Japanese occupation was something that can only be kind of be appreciated if you were experiencing it, especially towards the latter part of the occupation, when we were running out of food and we were running out of everything, and the Japanese kind of currency had depreciated so badly that you had to put it in a sack to buy a kilo of pork or a kilo or even a bag of rice. You needed a sack of Japanese notes to be able to buy it. So eventually the Japanese currency printed by them had lost its value. So in fact, people who hoarded pre-war Philippine currency were that much better off, because people were accepting the pre-war currency maybe at a factor of 1 to 200 or 1 to 500. So it was a situation where you were holding a lot of Japanese notes and they were worthless. So it was kind of chaotic in terms of what you could buy. So, and then of course, I told you about the constant bombing that we had in Baguio City, up in the mountains, where the Yamashita had holed up outside Baguio, but because of faulty intelligence, the Americans were bombing Baguio and killing civilians rather than any Japanese forces, and so it was bearable, put it that way, the first couple of years, maybe even 2.5 years, for people, young people like me. We were able to go to school, but limited, and so you kind of look at World War II in the Philippines as something that was not. It was even more difficult for the adults, for the male population especially, since they were kind of rounded up from time to time, and the Japanese would pick out people at random, and they would put them into prison, or they would just execute them. And of course, towards the end of the war, just like you see the atrocities happening in Ukraine, the Japanese forces, especially in Manila, went berserk and were just killing people as they saw them running all over the place. So the life was, of course, almost, it was kind of precious in a way, but people were shot like dogs. So it's not an experience that you want to go through. In fact, that's why I feel, with the war going on in Ukraine, it's me reliving the kind of experience we had during the war. My wife's grandfather was a graduate of West Point, 1917. So he was trained under the U.S. kind of U.S. military. So he in fact was the staff officer of General Eisenhower. At that time, MacArthur was in the Philippines as the commander of the U.S. Armed Forces in the Pacific, and Colonel Eisenhower was his chief of staff. Under Eisenhower was my grandfather-in-law who worked under him. So he was one of 5 Filipinos who were made generals when the war broke out. He went to the concentration camp. He was released about 4 months later, and then he was taken in and then again incarcerated, and then they released. And then in 1944, because he was suspected of being on the underground, the Japanese went to their house and picked him up and picked up his oldest son in December of 1944, and they were never seen again. So they really do not know where there was a mass grave in the North Cemetery in Manila where people said a lot of men were executed, and they think my grandfather-in-law was one of those who were executed and put in that mass grave. I was telling you that the Koreans who were at that time conscripts of the Japanese were I think less educated and less, I guess they were kind of from who were not really educated, and they were a lot more brutal. They were a lot more. I mean, they had no scruples. They were extremely cruel to women, especially. There were a lot of what they called comfort women that were recruited, and they were that was the other problem we had, was they would get women who were kind of in their 20s, and they would herd them, and they would be herded into places where they would satisfy their male instincts. Yeah. Well, as I told you, we walked 3 days and 2 nights over, I think, about maybe 15 mountain ranges. Going up from Baguio is about 6,000 feet above sea level, and so we walked down and slept. Just took snatches of nap along the way, and that's when I told you I met the first soldiers who were all on combat fatigues, and their helmets were new. They were different from the original helmets that I knew before the war, and that's when they fed us C rations and K rations, and then I told you that that was the day that Franklin Roosevelt died. That's why the flag was at half-mast in the advanced headquarters of those combat units. Incidentally, there were also Filipinos who grew up or who were from the US who also were part of the contingent. So there was a kind of Phil-American kind of units that were part of the American Expeditionary Force who interacted with the civilian units. And they of course spoiled us with all sorts of food. So it was especially difficult for people of maybe age 18 to 20 to maybe 50 were the most vulnerable, because they could be suspected of being a resistance fighter or an underground movement, and they would just be randomly picked up and killed. The Japanese surrendered in Manila in February, but the formal surrender of the Japanese in the Philippines was about April or May of 1945. They captured Yamashita, who was the commanding general in the Far East. He was the one. He was labeled the Tiger of Malaya because he captured Malaya and Singapore within a matter of a couple of weeks. The resistance in the Philippines was a lot more pronounced, and Yamashita was captured. He was brought to Baguio, where he signed the surrender, and then he was tried here for war crimes, and he was hanged. The memories of all the atrocities that happened in the Philippines at the hands of Japan were so vivid in the minds of people that the Japanese did not come to the Philippines. No Japanese came to the Philippines until about maybe 10 years later, 1956 or thereabouts. And no Japanese goods ever came in. And so all the things that came back to the Philippines were all American goods. And it took some time for Japanese Philippine relationship to normalize. I guess it started to normalize towards the latter half of the 50s, when there were reparations. There were Japanese payments to the Philippines for the damage that they caused the Philippines, but it was not nearly enough to compensate people for what they lost. But if you look at Japan and then compare it to the Philippines, Manila was much more damaged than Tokyo. So in the end, Japan was rehabilitated much faster than the Philippines, which was in a way ironic, because in fact the Japanese recovery was much faster than places like the Philippines.